World History of Christianity, Chapter 3, The Orthodox Church in Byzantium, Mary B. Cunningham. Then we went to Greece, and the Greeks led us to the edifices where they worshipped their God. And we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We know only that God dwells there among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations, for we cannot forget that beauty. This famous passage describes the reaction of a group of Russian emissaries to the great church in Constantinople in the 11th century. Sent by their king, Vladimir of Kiev, to the Khazars, Jews, Germans, Catholic Christians, Bulgars, Muslims, and Greeks, Orthodox Christians, in order to choose which of these religions he should adopt. The emissaries decided that there could be no comparison with the church and liturgy of the Greeks. This church seemed indeed to represent heaven on earth. Constantinople and the great church of Saint Sophia stood at the center of Eastern Orthodoxy in the Byzantine period, but the territory under the jurisdiction of the four Eastern patriarchates included in some periods most of Asia Minor, Greece, the Near East, Egypt, the Balkans, and eventually even Russia and the Ukraine. At the beginning of our period, during the reign of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, and partly due to his military activities, the sovereignty of the Roman Empire still encompassed the Near Eastern territories and North Africa. By the end of the 7th century, however, the Arabs had conquered most of these areas, causing Orthodox Christianity to become a minority religion and its faithful to be subject to the laws and taxes of a Muslim caliphate. Doctrinal differences also split the Eastern Orthodox Church, leading to the creation of the Assyrian Church of the East, often called Nestorian, and the 5 non-Chalcedonian churches, which are usually known as monophysite. From the 5th century onwards, rival patriarchs and Christian dioceses existed side by side in the Near East. Whereas successive Byzantine emperors and ecumenical, i.e. Constantinopolitan patriarchs, strove in the early centuries to heal this rift and to unify the Orthodox Church, these efforts seem to have been abandoned after the Arab conquests, perhaps owing to the recognition that these lands had, in any case, been lost forever to the Eastern Roman Empire. The aim of this chapter is to provide a general outline of the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church, beginning in the 6th century during the reign of Justinian and ending with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. In some ways, these dates represent purely arbitrary limits. The history of the Orthodox Church begins, as does that of all the other Christian churches, with the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, and it continues in the areas in which it was founded up until the present day. If we define this chapter as a history of the Byzantine Orthodox Church, including its offshoots in the Near East and missions to the Slavs, however, then 527 to 1453 CE becomes an appropriate choice of dates. It is only in the 6th century that Orthodox Christianity achieved its definitive character as the dominant religion of the Eastern Roman Empire, as seen in the way the liturgy was celebrated and the increase in popular devotion to such holy objects as icons, relics, and above all, the Virgin Mary. With the building of the great church, Constantinople came to represent the true center of Chalcedonian Byzantine orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy lost its protection in the secular arm of the state when Constantinople fell to the Turks. Thus, 1453 does represent the end of the association of the Orthodox Church with the Eastern Roman Empire. The account which follows will not focus purely on the institutional history of the Orthodox Church, however. It is our aim to trace as well its social and cultural background. Ordinary lay people, monks and clergy, aristocrats, emperors and empresses all play a part in the church and contributed in various ways to its spirituality. The artifacts and texts which survive represent our primary witnesses to this development and all tell a varied, sometimes contradictory tale. It is clear that in the Byzantine Orthodox Church, as in any other Christian tradition, we are dealing with a spiritual and institutional structure which was influenced as much by the laity as it was by those individuals who occupied the highest ranks in the priestly hierarchy. The Byzantine state was seen by its own rulers and subjects as an earthly image of the heavenly kingdom above. This meant that its social organization was hierarchical, with one absolute ruler representing Christ, holding sway over all his subjects. The emperor was responsible for maintaining harmony within the church, for this would both ensure divine favor for the empire and contribute to the effective governance of the secular state. The patriarch, backed by the synod of bishops, exercised considerable authority as well, however. He could, and occasionally did, oppose imperial policy, as for example, during the monothelite controversy in the 7th century, iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th, and during negotiations for reunion with the papacy in the 13th and 15th centuries. The fact that a patriarch could be deposed if he disagreed with an emperor reveals the extent of the latter's power in dictating ecclesiastical policy. On the other hand, if an emperor faced opposition not only from the patriarch but from the rest of the clergy, the monastics, and even the laity, his chances of enforcing an unpopular policy were much reduced. The theoretical basis for absolute rule under a Christian monarch was elaborated in the 4th century by Constantine the Great's historian and apologist Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius skillfully combined Christian ideology and imagery with Hellenistic conceptions of divine kingship in order to create a new, specifically Byzantine political ideology. While the Byzantine state cannot be described as Caesaro-Papist, since the emperor was not ordained as a member of the clergy, nor could he officially enact ecclesiastical policies, the religious and the secular spheres were much more closely integrated than they are in most modern states. Just as important as his military and political functions was the emperor's role in the church's liturgical celebrations. The emperor was responsible for ensuring that Orthodox belief was enforced throughout the empire, and that his subjects worshipped God in the correct manner. Not only could this provide either divine wrath or favor in this world, but it could determine salvation in the next. The 6th century, the revival of the Christian Roman Empire. The Emperor Justinian, succeeding his uncle Justin I, 518 to 527, came to the throne of the Eastern Empire in 527. Justinian came from a peasant background in the Balkan provinces, but he was in fact highly educated and intensely interested in church policy and doctrine. Seeking to restore the original boundaries of the Roman Empire, including the western territories which had been lost to Germanic tribes in the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, Justinian undertook an ambitious plan of military reconquest, beginning in North Africa and moving on to Italy and finally even Spain. Linked to his military campaigns was the emperor's overriding ambition to reunify the church by either reconciling or abandoning the powerful monophysite movement which had its base in the eastern territories, and by restoring a friendly understanding with Rome. The monophysite policies of some of Justinian's predecessors, especially the Emperor Anastasius, Anastasios, 491 to 418, had strained the relationship between the papacy and the patriarchate in Constantinople. One of Justinian's main ambitions seems to have been to restore unity within the Christian Roman Empire as a whole, at the same time enforcing his own military dominance as its supreme ruler. Even in 527, pagan cult practices and cultural attitudes were still to be found in the Eastern Roman Empire. One of Justinian's religious aims was to eradicate paganism entirely from public life, as is revealed by his closing of the Academy of Athens in 529. On the other hand, the Orthodox liturgy and its accompanying imperial ceremony was being elaborated as never before in this period. It was in the 6th century, during the reign of Justinian, that the Byzantine Rite became fully imperial. The Eucharist service, called the Divine Liturgy, acquired new splendor through the addition of hymns such as the Cherubicon. The church calendar grew in complexity as new feasts were added and special hymns and readings were produced in their honor. One of the most striking features of the imperial rite in Constantinople must have been the stational liturgies or processions from one church or holy place to another, each of which represented stages in the celebrations for a particular day. Processions such as these, which probably began in the late 4th century, and in which not only the patriarch and all his clergy, but also frequently the emperor himself participated, provided occasions in which the population at large could play a part, both as spectators and as participants. The Byzantine liturgy, although it later became much more confined to the church interior, still retains elements both of these elaborate processions and of the imperial vestments worn by both emperors and clergy. Among the greatest achievements of Justinian's reign were the building of churches such as St. Sophia in Constantinople and the production of liturgical poetry and other literature. Numerous contemporary writers recorded their reactions to the awesome proportions of the great church. The church has been made a spectacle of great beauty, stupendous to those who see it, and altogether incredible to those who hear of it. He, Justinian, built an incomparably great pile, such as has never been recorded. I mean the great church that is so beautiful and glorious as to exceed the power of speech. While such accounts are exaggerated, they unanimously convey the sense of innovation which accompanied the building of St. Sophia. From this period onward, most Byzantine churches imitated the great church in their construction. Symbolically, they represented a heaven on earth, based on a Platonic conception of the cosmos reaching from God's throne in heaven to the earthly realm below. Accompanying the architectural developments in this century was the production of liturgical texts, including above all the hymnographic form known as the Kontakion, a narrative sermon in verse, characterized both by dramatic dialogue and by theological teaching. Romanos, the melodist, probably the most famous of all Byzantine hymnographers, lived and worked during the reign of Justinian. Many of his hymns survive, covering important events in the Old Testament and in the life of Christ. In the 8th century, another hymnographic form, the canon, was introduced into the service of orthros, matins, in the monastic rite. The two genres continued to be composed for the appropriate rites, the monastic and the cathedral, until as late as 1204. In order to understand the developments in dogmatic theology which took place in the 6th century, it is necessary to go back to the events and personalities surrounding the Council of Chalcedon in 451, partly because of the influence of two distinct schools of theology which had developed in Alexandria and Antioch in the preceding centuries, the former emphasizing the allegorical or spiritual meaning of the scriptures, and the latter their literal meaning. Disagreement broke out concerning the definition of Christ and the relationship between his human and divine natures. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 succeeded to some extent in formulating a compromise between the Alexandrian and the Antiochene views of the incarnation of Christ, but its final text included insistence on Christ's existence in two natures, a wording which many monophysites found that they could not accept. It is one of the tragedies in the history of Christianity that the formula which was eventually agreed at Chalcedon, which in fact represented a carefully worded compromise between the ideas of Christ's two distinct natures and his personal unity, should have led to a split between the monophysite, one nature, and the diophysite, two natures, churches, which has lasted until the present day. The dogmatic formulations of the 6th century represent part of an imperially led movement to reconcile the monophysites, which continued until the end of the 7th century. The Emperor Justinian saw the unification of the Christian Church as closely connected with his political restoration of the Roman Empire. Although his efforts in this direction ultimately failed, they did deeply influence the Byzantine dogmatic tradition. At the beginning of the 6th century, various events served to place Christological controversy firmly back on the agenda. In 519, a movement called Theopaschitism, probably introduced into Constantinople by 4 Scythian monks, argued that one of the Holy Trinity suffered in the flesh. Believing that this formula would serve to reconcile the monophysites, Justinian decided to accept the new doctrine. Fierce opposition to the Theopaschite formula, however, centered in the monastery of the Akoimatoi, the sleepless ones, who saw it as undermining the reality of Christ's human incarnation. Other Diophysite theologians, perhaps also in an effort to reconcile the monophysites, embarked on a mission to reclaim Cyril of Alexandria for the Chalcedonian cause. Their argument, expressed in a variety of texts, including the Florilegium Cyrillianum, sought to prove that Cyril's teachings were in fact consistent with the principal formula of the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon. This movement encountered powerful opposition, however, in the monophysite theologian Severus, who was bishop of Antioch between 512 and 518. Severus fiercely opposed the appropriation of Cyril of Alexandria by the movement which has come to be known as Neo-Chalcedonian. Severus of Antioch's powerful intellect dominates the monophysite cause in the 6th century, whereas monophysite theologians such as Sergius the Grammarian and Julian of Halicarnassus adopted extreme views such as that the body of Christ remained incorruptible even before the resurrection. Severus, who frequently found it necessary to oppose extreme monophysites such as these, as well as Chalcedonians, adhered to a moderate monophysitism, teaching that there is one divine nature in Christ, but that he also possessed genuinely human qualities. The difference between this doctrine and that of the Chalcedonians rests primarily on their various understandings of the union of the two natures of Christ in the Incarnation. Whereas moderate monophysites found the teaching of two distinct natures in Christ illogical, they did not reject his humanity altogether. Instead, they argued that while he possessed one divine nature, this was formed out of human and divine qualities. The Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553 reflects Justinian's recognition that Chalcedon and moderate monophysitism were to some extent reconcilable. The conclusions agreed in this council included A. The unity of Christ in one divine hypostasis. Note that the term physis, nature, and hypostasis, entity, are by now carefully distinguished. B. The orthodoxy of the Theopaschite formula. C. The condemnation of the so-called three chapters. That is, three of the most important proponents of the Antiochene school: Theodore of Odessa, Theodoret of Syrtis, and Ebus of Edessa. The anathemas of the Fifth Ecumenical Council have been seen by some scholars as a fatal attempt to reconcile the Monophysites at the expense of Antiochene theology. Certainly the definitions of Christological doctrine endorsed in the 6th century determined the development of dogmatic theology in the Orthodox Church thereafter. On the other hand, the acceptance and reintegration of the theology of the 5th century theologian Cyril of Alexandria can only be seen as enriching. Orthodox Christological doctrine. Okay. The acceptance and reintegration of the theology of the 5th century theologian Cyril of Alexandria can only be seen as enriching Orthodox Christological doctrine. It is unfortunate that in spite of such an achievement, the Fifth Ecumenical Council completely failed in its primary objective, that of reconciling the majority of Monophysites. Another major obstacle to the reunification of the Monophysite and Chalcedonian churches in the 6th century lay in the missionary activities of figures such as Jacob Baradios. Jacob, who was patronized in Constantinople by the Monophysite Empress Theodora, was ordained bishop in Edessa at her instigation in order to counterbalance the anti-Monophysite activities of Ephraim, Chalcedonian bishop of Antioch, 527 to 545. With an independent Monophysite jurisdiction now extending over many parts of the Near East, Jacob Baradaeus was able to appoint bishops in many cities, including some in the Aegean and the west coast of Asia Minor, such as Chios and Ephesus. Many of these bishops were drawn from Syrian monasteries, so that the Monophysite hierarchy soon displayed a distinctly Syrian character. It was the establishment of this rival episcopal hierarchy which enabled Monophysite Christians eventually to regard themselves as a completely independent and autonomous church. The persecution which these churches suffered during the reign of Justinian and his successors may have contributed to their sense of cultural and ethnic identity and to their opposition to the imperial Chalcedonian Church. It is likely, however, in view of the strong religious tendencies of the population at large, that Monophysites and Chalcedonians backed their local church leaders because they believed that their dogmatic teaching was correct. It is also noteworthy that doctrinal persuasion was not determined completely by geographical location in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The Near East, including present-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, included adherents to all the rival churches, whereas emperors and empresses in this period could choose to back either Monophysite or Chalcedonian Christology. Thus the emperors Zeno and Anastasios were Monophysites, while Justinian, who officially backed the Chalcedonian cause, sought some compromises. It is possible that the solution which Byzantine theology ultimately adopted, namely the recognition that a hypostatic union of two natures could be understood in various ways, came just too late. There can be no doubt that political factors played some part in the tragic and apparently irreconcilable division of the Church in this period. Parallel to developments in dogmatic theology were those in tradition of monastic teaching, which was based partly on the practical living out of the ascetic and spiritual life by hermits and monks throughout the Byzantine Empire, and partly on a highly developed and subtle genre of philosophical literature which accompanied this. This monastic tradition of ascetic teaching was indebted most of all to the 4th century Father Evagrios, who in turn was influenced by the teachings of Origen, circa 185 to 254, while Origen, with his attempt to create a complete Christian cosmology in his book On First Principles, represents one of the most innovative early Christian writers, most of his writings were later condemned by the Orthodox Church. Origen's hierarchical view of the Trinity was seen as subordinationism, and above all, his teachings concerning the pre-existence of souls and his separation of intellect from the material body came to be regarded as dangerously dualist in a Christian context. The monastic followers of Origen and Evagrios became sufficiently numerous in the 5th and 6th centuries, however, to cause serious disquiet, especially in the monasteries of Palestine. According to contemporary sources, some monks claimed to be equal to Christ by restoring their original intellectual relationship with God through prayer and contemplation. This extreme and obviously heretical form of Origenism was condemned first by imperial decree in 543, and then at the 5th Ecumenical Council in 553. The writings of Evagrios and Origen were largely destroyed and survive only partially in Latin and Syriac translations or under pseudonymous titles. It is important to note, however, that the condemnation of Origen and the writers whom he influenced did not eradicate their ideas from the Byzantine spiritual tradition. Like all other heresies in the early church, Origenism, by forcing a debate concerning certain issues, significantly influenced the development of monastic theology. In addition to its importance in the formulation of church doctrine, the 6th century is regarded by most historians as the turning point between the still outwardly secular jurisdiction of the later Roman Empire and the development of a fully Christian medieval state. The development of the imperial liturgical rite has already been discussed. This was accompanied by an increase in popular devotion to various cults, including those of the holy relics of saints, icons, and above all, the Theotokos, God bearer or Mother of God. Religious devotion of this kind was not confined to the lower and middle classes, but was promoted by the government itself as a way to focus the loyalties of the population towards a divinely led and sanctioned emperor. Imperial ceremonies involving processions with icons, relics, and other holy objects served to emphasize the saving power of the divine in this world. The Virgin Mary became the most powerful of these symbols of divine intercession. The unforgettable image of the siege of 7 August 626, when the Virgin appeared and helped to fight off the Avars and Slavs, who were at the very gates of Constantinople, represents a high point in the history of her cult. Poetry in the form of both homilies and hymns had been appearing in honor of the Mother of God from the 5th century onwards. It is after the end of the 6th century, when the last of her feasts, the Dormition, had been instituted, however, that these genres reached their most developed form. The increase in devotion to the Virgin Mary in this period was accompanied by the growth in the popular use of holy images or icons, both in church and at home. As this cult gained importance, a long-standing opposition to images, which had always existed within the church because of Old Testament prohibitions against idolatry, began also to resurface. Texts both for and against the cult of icons do testify to its existence, however, and there can be no doubt that by the beginning of the 8th century, when iconoclasm first acquired imperial backing, Orthodox Christians' dependence on holy objects and images, operating as channels of divine power, had increased significantly since the late 6th century. Holy men, sometimes under the protection of monasteries, and sometimes as free agents, also continued to wield considerable spiritual power in late 6th and early 7th century Byzantine society. At the beginning of the 7th century, John Machos wrote a collection of edifying stories about the ascetics and monks of Palestine and Egypt, known as the Spiritual Meadow. This includes a number of miracle stories, such as the following vivid account involving an icon. The same fathers also told us that in those days, a Christ-loving woman of the district of Apamea dug a well. She spent a great deal of money on the project and dug very deep, but she found no water. Having put so much money and effort into the project, she was very discouraged. Then one day, she had a vision of somebody saying to her, "Send for and bring the picture of Abba Theodosios at Skopelos, and by that means God will give you water." The woman sent 2 men at once. They took the icon of the saint and let it down into the well, and immediately water began to flow. It filled the well shaft up to the halfway point. The men who drew the icon up out of the water brought us some of it. We drank of it and all gave thanks to God. Other sources which reveal much about popular and monastic spirituality in the early 7th century include John Climakos's Ladder of Divine Ascent and Anastasios of Sinai's Questions and Answers. The latter text in particular provides valuable insight into the sorts of questions which occupied ordinary people's minds at this time. Such day-to-day problems as how often the laity should partake of the Eucharist, what sort of preparation was required for participation in this great mystery, and many others are addressed in a clear and practical way. The 7th century and monothelitism. The 7th century was dominated by military confrontations, first with the Persians, who succeeded in taking most of the Byzantine Empire's Near Eastern territories, including the Holy Land, in 614. The Persian capture of Jerusalem's most holy relic, the true cross, and its removal to Ctesiphon, represented for Orthodox Christians a spiritual catastrophe. In addition to other material and territorial losses, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by Constantine, was destroyed by fire in the Persian sack of the city. Avar and Slav advances also began from the north, so that the empire slowly lost control of most of its Balkan territory. In spite of these reverses, however, the Emperor Heraclius managed to rally the imperial army to the extent that all of these threats were eventually overcome, or at least put into abeyance. Concentrating first on overcoming the Persians, Heraclius bribed the Avars to delay their offensive. In the years between 619 and 628, he was able to defeat the Persians and to recapture Jerusalem, along with most of the other territories which they had invaded, while the Avars, having been defeated by the Byzantines at the very walls of Constantinople, retreated into the Balkans, where they were eventually overpowered by the Slavs. One result of Heraclius's recovery of the eastern territories was the reopening of the issue of church unity and reconciliation with the monophysite churches. Now that Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were once more under Roman rule, it seemed imperative to Heraclius and his ecclesiastical advisors that the long-standing misunderstanding between Chalcedonian and monophysite Christians should be resolved. Sergius, Patriarch of Constantinople between 610 and 638, was responsible for devising a new attempt at a formula of compromise. The doctrine, called monoenergism, taught that whereas Christ has two natures, one divine and one human, he possesses a single activity or energy in Greek. With the backing of Pope Honorius in Rome, monoenergism appears initially to have met with some success in local Eastern churches. The Armenian church agreed to the formula and was welcomed back into the imperial church in 630, while, even more importantly, in 631, the metropolitan of Phasis, Kairos, agreed to monoenergism and was soon after appointed Patriarch of Alexandria. Persuasion was reinforced by persecution, but even so, monoenergism seems at first to have been fairly successful among the monophysite population of Egypt. Opposition to monoenergism as a theological doctrine, however, soon began to be voiced by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronios, a venerable and eloquent figure who had traveled with John Moschos through the monasteries of Palestine and Egypt in the course of his long and distinguished career. In 634, Sophronios issued a synodical letter to his fellow patriarchs in which he argued that monoenergism represented a form of monophysitism. This letter seems to have had the effect of turning the popes in Rome, beginning with Honorius, against the doctrine of monoenergism. Partly in response to this opposition, the Patriarch Sergius, backed by Heraclius, issued first his Thesphos decision, and then in 638, the Ekthesis statement, a document in which the formula of a single energy had been transformed into one of a single will, monothelitism. At first, even Sophronios seems to have accepted the new formulation, at least as it was set forth in the Thesphos. By 638, however, he had begun to have doubts and directed his efforts towards convening a church council to discuss the monothelite doctrine. When this failed, Sophronios appealed to Rome again, but organizing resistance to monothelitism, which had just received official endorsement from the Pope, proved to be difficult. Sophronios soon acquired a powerful ally, however, in one of the greatest of all Byzantine theologians, Saint Maximus the Confessor. Maximus, born in 580, led a wandering monastic life in Asia Minor, North Africa, and Rome. During his travels, Maximus succeeded in stirring up opposition to monothelitism, most notably in Rome. After Constans II issued an imperial decree known as the Typos, which forbade any discussion of one will or one energy, two wills or two energies, Pope Martin II convened a council in October 649, at which 105 bishops agreed to reaffirm the doctrine of Chalcedon, to make explicit the doctrine of two energies and two wills in Christ, and to condemn both the ekthesis and the typos. In what represents one of the most shameful episodes in Byzantine church history, the emperor then ordered the arrest of the pope. He was taken to Constantinople, tried and convicted of treason, and exiled to the northern province of Cherson, where he died soon after on 16 September 655, a tired and broken old man. Maximus, like Pope Martin, was condemned for treason, tortured and mutilated, and finally exiled to Lazica. He died as a martyr to the Orthodox faith, and only later received the recognition and veneration which he deserved. Maximus the Confessor's theology developed in response to monothelitism, but it transcended that controversy in its importance to the Byzantine theological synthesis. Deeply influenced by Origen and by the 5th century mystical writer P.S. Dionysius the Areopagite, Maximus understood Christian theology as a message of salvation which redeems the whole of creation as well as humanity. Christ's incarnation, he argued, could not be seen as anything other than the fulfillment of God's original plan when he created the world out of nothing. Every human being, created in the image of God and representing in himself the whole of the cosmos, has the potential not only to be saved, but to regain his original state as an image of God. Such an aim can be achieved through ascetic discipline, through the grace bestowed by the sacraments, and by faith in the incarnate Lord. Maximus's all-encompassing theology influenced the development of Byzantine Christological doctrine, especially in the subsequent century, as Orthodox theologians such as John of Damascus developed a theological response to the attack on holy images. Monothelitism as an imperially backed church doctrine lasted for another generation, but it ultimately failed in its political aim. The opposition of such figures as Sophronios of Jerusalem and Maximus the Confessor, backed by a succession of Roman popes, led to the abandonment of the doctrine at the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680 to 681. With the rise of Islam and the rapid loss of most Near Eastern territories to the Arabs in the mid-7th century, and the deterioration in relations between East and West, it is likely that the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IV, 668 to 685, and his advisors realized that their ecclesiastical policy was divisive rather than unifying. After this period, no further efforts were made by the Imperial Chalcedonian Church to reintegrate the monophysite churches into its fold. The fact that the Christian Church was irrevocably divided mainly along political boundaries seems instead to have finally been accepted. Another serious implication of the monothelite controversy was its place in the slow but irreversible drift apart of the western and eastern halves of Christendom. The arrest of Pope Martin II by Byzantine imperial envoys is shocking in itself, but it also provided a dangerous precedent for future interaction between the sees of Rome and Constantinople. Perhaps it is already in the 7th century that we perceive the seeds of the mutual distrust, misunderstanding, and eventually schism which were to characterize East-West relations in future centuries. The Iconoclast Controversy, 726 to 843. The controversy over icons, known as iconoclasm, dominates the history of the Byzantine Church in the 8th and early 9th centuries. This event, which has been described by most historians as a watershed in Byzantine history affected many aspects of political, social, and religious life. The adoption of an iconoclast policy by a series of emperors beginning with Leo III in 726 was to some extent unprecedented in church history and had serious implications for church-state relations thereafter. The role which monks and monasteries played in resisting iconoclast policy, especially during the first period of iconoclasm between about 760 and 787, was to contribute to the growing importance of monasticism in Byzantine society in subsequent centuries. East-West relations were affected as iconophiles appealed to the Pope for support, while the long imperial support for the iconoclasts soured relations between the two Romes, despite the warm reception of the Roman delegates at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, held at Nicaea in 787. Finally, the debate over the nature and uses of images in religious worship helped iconophile theologians to develop a dogmatic theology in defense of icons, which became central to Orthodox doctrine. The final rejection of iconoclasm in 843 opened the way for the development of a distinctive iconography and the extensive decoration of Byzantine churches in subsequent centuries. The causes for the outbreak of iconoclasm in the early 8th century have been discussed extensively by scholars. Whereas some have seen Leo III's Syrian origins and undoubted contact with iconoclastic groups in that area, including Muslims, Jews, and Paulicians, as a possible cause, others have seen iconoclasm as a reform movement which originated in the Byzantine ecclesiastical hierarchy itself. The chronicler Theophanes states that Leo interpreted an earthquake and tidal wave in the Aegean Sea as signs of God's wrath at Christians' relapse into superstition and idolatry. It is likely that the debate concerning the causes of iconoclasm will never be resolved. What historians are increasingly studying, however, is the entire political and theological background of the conflict. There can be no doubt that the conquest of the entire Near East and North Africa by the Muslims and their continuing incursions into Byzantine territory in the late 7th and early 8th centuries influenced ideological developments in the Eastern Roman Empire in this period. The debate concerning the production and veneration of holy icons centered first on the prohibition against idolatry in Exodus 20, 4-5. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Jews, Christians in the early church, and later Muslims all remained faithful to this commandment, although in all three religious traditions exceptions were occasionally made. It was the Christians, however, who introduced images into collective and private worship to the greatest extent in the centuries following the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and who began to develop a theological defense of this practice even before the outbreak of iconoclasm. Early 8th century iconophiles defended themselves against the charge of idolatry with various arguments, including the long-standing tradition of religious imagery in the church, the existence of miraculous icons made without hands, some of which were thought to date to the time of Christ himself, and the unanswerable statement that since the incarnation of Christ, no form of Christian worship could be called idolatry. Germanos, Patriarch of Constantinople until 730 when he was deposed by Leo III, for resisting iconoclasm, developed some of these arguments in his writings. But the defense was raised to a much higher level by his contemporary in Arab-ruled Palestine, the monk and theologian John of Damascus. using a Neoplatonic frame of reference which had been developed by P.S. Dionysios the Areopagite and Maximus the Confessor, John examined what an image actually is and how it is used in Christian worship. In 3 treatises directed against the teachings of the iconoclasts, John distinguished between various types of images, separating man-made ones, such as icons, from those which are natural, such as the relation of Christ the Son to the Father. Just as the nature of these images differs, so does the veneration, prokinesis, or worship, latria, paid to them by Christians. John further argues that in the incarnation of Christ, an eternal and decisive change took place in the relationship between God and his creation. Since God appeared in the flesh and lived among men, it became possible to depict him in his human form. To deny this, as the iconoclasts were currently doing, would be to deny the reality of the incarnation and, in effect, to believe with monophysites that the divine nature of Christ dominated the human one. By using these arguments, John of Damascus succeeded in raising the debate concerning the use of religious images within the church to a Christological level. Judging by the few surviving iconoclastic texts, the opponents of images seem to have failed to formulate an adequate response to the theology developed by John of Damascus and his successors. The fundamental difference between their approach to images and that of the iconophiles was that they regarded images as essentially identical to their prototypes. Thus, to attempt to depict God, even in his human incarnation, represented to the iconoclasts a form of idolatry. Iconophile theology advanced further in the second period of iconoclasm, 815 to 843, as theologians such as Theodore, abbot of the monastery of Studios, and Nicephorus, patriarch of Constantinople, 806 to 815, explored the philosophical implications of the controversy. Following in the footsteps of John of Damascus, they examined further the hierarchical relationship between images and their prototypes, as well as the Christological dimensions of the debate. Ultimately, iconophiles stressed not only the acceptability, but also the necessity of Christian images. They accused the iconoclasts not only of denying Christ's incarnation, but also of a dualist denial of the essential goodness of the material world as God's creation. The Orthodox theology of images asserts that God is present in the created world, that he does manifest his power through certain sanctified objects, such as icons, and that these objects reflect in some way the mystery of the incarnation. It is important, nevertheless, to remember that a hierarchy exists in the created world as well as in the heavenly one in Orthodox theology. The sanctity of an icon does not, for example, take precedence over the Holy Gospels or the Eucharist. Another issue of scholarly debate in this period has been the attitude of iconoclast emperors, especially Constantine V, in the mid-8th century towards monks and monasteries. Polemical iconophile writers such as Theophanes state that monasteries were confiscated and turned into public buildings for secular purposes, while monks were rounded up and imprisoned or exiled if they refused to renounce their monastic calling. Theophanes also describes how Constantine forced the abbots of all the monasteries in Constantinople to parade in the hippodrome, each one holding a woman by the hand. In other passages, he mentions the torture and execution of various holy men. The biased nature of Theophanes' narrative, which also dwells on Emperor Constantine V's excesses and moral depravity, however, renders the truth of these stories suspect. On the other hand, there can be no doubt that sporadic persecution of monks did take place in this period. It is likely that Constantine held a particular grudge against monks and monasteries, and that this was connected with his distrust of icons, relics, and other popular cults. In the second period of iconoclasm, 815 to 843, the division between iconophiles and iconoclasts was by no means so clear-cut. Many monasteries in this period seem to have adopted iconoclasm, whereas the secular clergy backed either party. The fact that Theodore of Studios, who was responsible for organizing iconophile resistance at this time, also initiated a movement of reform which led to a widespread revival of monasticism in Constantinople, may account for the fact that even in this period, the sources associate the defense of holy icons mainly with monks and monasteries. As in 787, the restoration of icons to the church came about in 843 under a female ruler, in this case the Empress Theodora, who acted as regent for her young son Michael III until 856. The motivation for maintaining iconoclasm as an imperial policy had been waning since before the death of Theodora's husband, Theophilos, in 842. Since the devastating Battle of Amorion in 838, when this central Anatolian stronghold, and more significantly, the hometown of Theophilos's father, Michael II, fell to the Arabs, iconoclasm could no longer be linked convincingly with Byzantine military success. Like various other women in influential positions in this period, Theodora was a secret iconophile throughout her husband's reign and had a personal interest in restoring the holy icons in 843. She also had the backing of members of the church hierarchy and of key figures in the secular government. Methodios, appointed Patriarch of Constantinople in 843, did his best to eradicate iconoclast elements from within the church, replacing iconoclast bishops with iconophiles, some of whom had suffered persecution and imprisonment under the iconoclast emperors. The overturning of the old order and the inauguration of the new was officially celebrated on the first Sunday of Lent, 11 March 843, by a ceremony in the great church during which the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, a document probably composed by Methodios himself, was read out. This text, which represents a crucial source for the Byzantines' own perception of what constituted orthodox or right belief in this period. It is also a splendid example of theatrical display. The document consists mainly of a list of the figures who defended icons, followed by the acclamation eternal memory. Those who opposed the veneration of icons, on the other hand, are anathematized. An abridged version of the document is still read out on the Sunday of Orthodoxy in many Orthodox churches today.